ions, which are responsible for acidity. And we're going to see how all of these things oscillate and travel in waves within cells. So here's an example of a, and this is not my work, this is from Howard Pettijohn. What you're seeing here is a dye that allows you to look at the NAD level in the cell and whether it has the hydrogens on it or it's lost the hydrogens. And you see that it moves down the cell in waves and continues in these waves. So here's an outline of a cell, and here it's at this end of the cell, there it was at that end. And so you see you generate these oscillations. And this has to be done in with very sensitive instrumentation, because if you just were to look at the light coming from this cell, when you hit it, when you're looking at fluorescent phenomena, you would see that. It's only when you can look at it with a very fine resolution using special instrumentation that you can see these waves traveling within the cell. So this is a biological example of how cells are harnessing energy, and how that energy is forming these kinds of organized structures that I was describing in a test tube environment. Here it's happening within a cell. And to show you again how broad it is, here we're looking at a similar phenomena where we have waves of protons essentially responsible for acidity traveling through the cell. So again, spatial temporal structures, organization in time and space. And here we have a very interesting one. Here's the outline of our cell. Here's the reduced NADPH. We see it traveling down the cell. And at the end of the cell, using a separate dye, another dye, we see a burst of free radicals emerging out of the cell. So what we've seen here is how the cell has used energy and converted it into free radicals, so we can basically be nuking the environment, so we can sanitize it. This is great. You have a cut, you want to sanitize the environment. You don't want to get an infection. The problem is, similar problem to with nuclear weapons and smart weapons in general, you have collateral damage. Well, that collateral damage means that you're exposing all of the neighboring cells to these free radicals. And it turns out that cannabinoids, as was mentioned to you, are fundamentally involved in regulating the free radical production, both when it's occurring, as we just saw, as a focused, purposeful entity, and also when it's the result of a biochemical imbalance where it's sensing the environment. Because remember, the key to forming these dissipative structures is that things have to be flowing into the life form in order to maintain the organization. And it's, you change the environment, and there's a perturbation in the biochemistry, and the cells sense that often by making free radicals and then causing responses to those free radicals, so that the chemistry of the cell is able to, again, better absorb the potential of the environment to maintain the organization of the structure. All right, so here's a hypothetical make-believe chart, and what we're seeing is that what we're looking at is distance from equilibrium, essentially how far the life battery is charged up. And we see that when you're young, it's very natural to grow and to increase your distance from equilibrium, but then we reach adulthood, and then we start to decline. Well, we're no longer growing physically, but we still have the same physical principles regulating us. How do we maintain our distance from equilibrium? And typically what we have happening is we get older, we start to decline, we maybe have some catastrophic disease. If we're lucky, we recover, and then we continue, the slow descent back to equilibrium, which is death. So what we'd like to be able to do is, reduce the steepness of that slope. And again, if free radicals are the friction of life and cannabinoids are the oil, cannabinoids should help reduce that descent, and it should help reduce the occurrence and the probability of some of these disease-related dips. Although keep in mind that there are certain cases where cannabinoids would be the worst thing to use. And we'll go into that in a little while. So anyway, there's some indications that what I'm saying actually makes sense. In that, if you take the knockout mice that were referred to, where you've eliminated a gene, so you have a strain of mice that are missing a gene, one of the two strains of mice that are knockout mice for the CB1 receptor, they die prematurely. They die prematurely because they don't have their cannabinoid system working. They're not oiling themselves enough, so they die earlier. All right? And there was a complementary study to that done intramurally at the NIH, and I think it was 1996, where they fed THC to mice and rats in high concentrations, ridiculously high concentrations, and one of the consequences was that the mice lived longer and they had fewer tumors. Well, that study wasn't released, and it wasn't released until somebody leaked it to, I think it was the Oakland Cannabis Group, but it was leaked to an AIDS activist group, and then the study was released. Now, when you go on to PubMed, which is a database put out by the NIH of significant amounts of the scientific literature, the biomedical scientific literature, and you find this article has no authors on it. It's the only one in there with no authors on it. And it's never been published anywhere other than as this extended abstract. So that makes you wonder if there's an agenda sometimes behind science, as opposed to just the search for truth, which is what science officially is. So it turns out that we all have a direction to our imbalances. That's because we're aging. It's determined by the accumulation of free radical-induced changes that result in a decreased efficiency of our biochemical flow. And we're all getting older, not younger. So is marijuana the ultimate holistic medicine if it's coordinating and balancing all of these different, these different organized entities within our bodies? Or is it the devil's weed, as others would have us believe? And here you see a poster from one of these movies from the 1930s that captures the historical spirit behind marijuana prohibition. You have black men raping white women, and, it'll make a black man so arrogant that he'll step on a white man's shadow. This is all out of the newspapers. This is all realistic stuff that I'm telling you. This is the foundation of our drug war. So anyway, now I hopefully have convinced you that there is a creative nature to far from equilibrium physics, that creative nature can manifest itself in what appears to be highly improbable phenomena, and yet we can reproducibly do it. That tells you that the physics is explaining something, and that it's an intrinsic part of life. And now we'll go into some of the examples of the cannabinoid system and how it transcends organizational scales characteristic of life. So we see it working on a subcellular level. We see that leading up to consciousness. This is what we mean by transcending scales, and how its effect on consciousness has an impact on society. So this is why cannabinoids have such a unique evolutionary role, because they're transcending like this. So cannabinoids regulate cardiovascular health, and this is all work, again, sponsored by the NIH and researchers all around the world. This is coming out of peer-reviewed journals. I don't talk about my research because since I became chairman of the biology department, that's when I shifted to cannabinoid research, and it goes very, very slowly when you have to waste all your time being chairman. But we have some very interesting, important things that perhaps in some future time we'll be able to talk about. So right now it's more of my intellectual framework that I'm trying to share with you. So cannabinoids regulate cardiovascular health. And what you see here is that when you have an infarct, a heart attack, where you're blocking oxygen and eventually the oxygen reflows, and you have ischemia reperfusion, that generates injury. That injury is free radical associated. Here what you see is that you reduce the cell death in your heart through the endocannabinoid system. So presumably exocannabinoids of various forms will have similar effects. Here we see, again, dealing with the heart, that I think, and you can't really see where from where I'm at, one or two of these, one of these has to do with arrhythmia, the other has to do with cell death. And in both cases, the cannabinoids prevent cell death and arrhythmia, which are fundamental problems when you have cardiovascular disease, right? Here we see it's regulating the digestive system. And this is certainly, what I've done is just abstracted out from the abstract, the critical parts here. So we see that the pharmacological modulation of the endogenous cannabinoid system can provide new therapeutics for the treatment of a number of diseases. I can't go back. And what they include were things like GERDs, gastrointestinal reflux disease, paralytic ileitis, inflammation of the ileum, Crohn's disease, and irritable bowel syndrome, a whole variety of digestive system-related illnesses where people who are using cannabinoids knows it works. And, well, this is the foundation for it. It's this balancing act, again, of trying to restore biochemical health, essentially. So, as was already discussed, cannabinoids have a profound influence on the nervous system, and